Linda Hirsch.
I'm Jim Carney, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education.
In 2010, a jubilant Cory Booker, Chris Christie, and Mark Zuckerberg took to the Oprah Winfrey Show to announce their plans to reform Newark's failing school system. With a $100 million challenge grant from Mr. Zuckerberg and a host of initiatives ranging from firing bad teachers to expanding the city's charter school network, Newark seemed poised on the cusp of dramatic change. But was it change for the better? Today, Dale Rossakoff joins me to talk about her widely acclaimed book, The Prize: Who's in Charge of America's Schools? It is a dramatic and powerful look about what went wrong in the quest to overhaul Newark schools, and a cautionary tale for all who undertake school reform.
The book, The Prize, is making waves in education across the country, not only in Newark. Because of the importance of the questions it raises, we're devoting the majority of today's program to the subject. I'll be back later with Linda in the program for our Ed Bites, but we begin with Linda's conversation in the studio.
My guest today is Dale Russakoff, author of The Prize: Who's in Charge of America's Schools?, a book the New York Times calls one of the most important books on education to come along in years. Thank you for joining us today on EdCast.
Thanks for having me.
You know, when I finished your book, and it is a beautifully written, candid account of failed school reform in Newark, I really felt kind of sad, and I really didn't even know how to frame this conversation today, and I thought, what can we talk about? What should we talk about? So I want to start with, let's go to the beginning, Newark, the ground zero of your story. What was the situation like in Newark in terms of its schools before this whole effort to reform it?
Well, the schools were under state control, and they had been for 15 years. The state had taken them over in 1995 because there was so much corruption in the school district and such total neglect of kids, so that the state took control away from the local authorities. And in 15 years, very little had changed in terms of student achievement. In 2010, when all this began, fewer than 40% of children in the kindergarten through 8th grade schools were reading or doing math at grade level. And these are statistics that are very familiar in the poorest cities. And then in high school, barely 50% were graduating. And of those who graduated, 90% needed to have remedial courses at the local community college before taking college-level work.
So there were severe problems.
Yes.
Who were the key players in this movement?
Well, the key players were Cory Booker, at the time the mayor of Newark, Governor Christie, who was in his first term as governor of New Jersey, and Mark Zuckerberg, the philanthropist, whom they approached and who agreed to fund their reforms.
Now, you call your book The Prize. What was the prize?
Well, the prize, oddly enough, was not Mark Zuckerberg's $100 million gift. It was the $1 billion budget that the schools had been spending for years in delivering education to children in Newark.
So that's what everybody wanted to keep their hands in, that big pie.
And that's how all the corruption developed in 1995. The sort of years and years of political bosses and others salivating over this budget.
So along come the reformers. What were the key elements of their vision for how they were going to change this failed system?
Well, a big part of it was they wanted to dramatically expand charter schools in Newark. Cory Booker was a big believer that charter schools were doing a better job of delivering education than the district schools because they were not beholden to the powers that be. And that they weren't, governed by a heavily unionized bureaucracy, which the school district was. So he wanted to increase charter schools, and for what was left of the district schools, he wanted to have a dramatically different teachers' contract that would allow them to get rid of the weakest teachers and give merit pay to the best teachers, and also he wanted to do away with the system of seniority by which the most senior teachers made the most money. He wanted the teachers with the most merit to get the most money.
So this idea of expanding the charters, of course, and getting rid of bad teachers is certainly something we hear about in New York City as well, obviously, and probably in many other cities. Let's go back to this teacher idea here. How many bad teachers are there, do you think, in schools, and what would be the effect if tomorrow we could magically get rid of everybody?
I don't know. I mean, that's a question nobody ever answered, is how many teachers are bad teachers? And I think a big problem is that there was so little development and coaching and feedback for teachers. They would come into the Newark schools, they would go into their classroom, and they would sink or swim based on how well they did. There wasn't a lot of culture of them collaborating with other teachers or having senior teachers mentor them, or just getting the kind of observation and feedback that they needed to get better. So there were a lot of teachers who might have been excellent teachers who just never had the chance to get that support.
I have a brief video of Dana Goldstein, who wrote the book The Teacher Wars, in which she talks about the emphasis that we're placing on the importance of the teacher. So I'd like to play it for you and get your feedback on it.
When I was reporting on education in Washington, D.C. back in 2009, I went to an event where Arne Duncan, President Obama's Secretary of Education, was speaking. And he said the following: "A great teacher is a miracle worker. A great teacher can walk on water." And that was just staggering to me, the idea that to be a great teacher, you have to be like Jesus Christ, or you have to essentially be better than human. That's not realistic. Wendy Kopp, the founder of Teach for America, she wrote that a great teacher can trump poverty. The best research done by 3 economists, Raj Chetty, Jonah Rokoff, and John Friedman, found that teachers are responsible for approximately 7% of the current achievement gap. So that is 7% of the current gap between how poor children perform and how middle-class kids perform is due to differences in teacher quality. The rest of the achievement gap is driven by socioeconomic factors in the family and in the neighborhood. We need to address making the job an attractive job more than we need to focus on things like telling teachers that they can trump poverty. It might be inspiring at first, but even the great work you can do with an individual child to open up opportunities for them, which can change their individual life, there's a big gap between that and systematically on a national scale, using teachers as the means to address our inequality crisis. And if they're going to help get us there, is the way that we're doing it now the best way?
What do you think? What's your response to that?
Well, she's talking about what research has shown, and I think a lot of this education reform effort is not about research. It's about a gut feeling that teachers can do more and schools can do more. But all of the research does show that a teacher contributes, she said 7%, I've always read 10%, that 10% of a child's of the influences on a child's achievement comes from the teacher.
Now, your book has some wonderful stories about teachers who really, in my mind, went way beyond what we might expect of a teacher. And they really did wonderful things and had positive effects. I'm thinking of Olive, I'm thinking of the Princess Williams teacher. There were many people. What's your take on that? I mean, they had to undertake Herculean efforts, I think. I mean, really, putting in the kind of time that a lawyer starting out puts in that kind of time but gets a big check at the end. I mean, what was your take on that, this idea of putting in all that time and effort?
Well, you know, you can see just remarkable changes when there's a concentration of time and effort that goes into individual children. The problem is, how do you sustain that? So the boy that you mentioned, Alif, he went from being a second grade reader in 1 year to being a fifth grade reader. He was still a seventh grader, but he had gained 3 years of reading in 1 year thanks to a special ed teacher, an assistant principal, a principal, and his basketball coach, and his mother, who all really wrapped themselves around this boy who had been chronically failing all his life. He then went to high school, and that support didn't go with him. And he fell backwards. And it was so many things. I don't even know if you could even enumerate all the factors that led to his falling backwards. But the point is that there's so little consistency and predictability in these children's lives. And teachers do fill it in at certain points. But there are other times that they're not there, that things happen.
You mentioned teachers know things about transforming education that politicians don't know. What do you think teachers know that the politicians and the philanthropists didn't know about reforming education?
Well, I think there was very little focus in this whole reform effort on what happens at the classroom level. There was even an email that went out at one point from a member of Cory Booker's staff at the time this was all being planned that said MZ's money is not going to the classroom, meaning Mark Zuckerberg's money. The whole idea was systems change the incentives, increase the influence of data on decision making, and all of these changes that were made at the management level. But there wasn't the same focus on what has to happen at the classroom level, and that's where teachers and children do the work they do. And so that was one thing that I thought was really missing in this effort.
So now there are two things you're reminding me of. First is how we assess the teachers themselves, and I know you made a point of pointing out that the measurements that we use are perhaps not intended to evaluate teachers. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yes, I interviewed the measurement scientist who came up with the measurement system that is used in 30 states, including New Jersey, to evaluate teachers based on their student test scores. And he said that that measure was never intended to evaluate teachers. It does tell you whether a student has grown or not from one year to the next. It doesn't say why that student grew. And so he said the idea of the data, in his view, is to sit down with a teacher and say, okay, this is what the data shows about this student or about this class. What can we learn from this? And what, in other words, you can have a conversation, but it's the 7%, the 10%, right. It's not the 100%.
So don't assess the teacher's value
based on that data. Yeah,
flows into merit pay issues as well.
Yes, exactly.
So it's a big thing. Now, the charters themselves, again, you have really so many compelling stories. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed reading the book, even though it left me profoundly disturbed in a certain way, because it was so well written and conveyed the story so beautifully. The charters themselves, when we take a look at them, and you, as I said, have some wonderful stories about some successes in these schools, comparing them to the district schools that were also struggling really hard and trying to deliver services. What did you see? And you mentioned the Kip Spark School. What do you see as some of the key issues that may have made some of those charters more effective in this particular story?
Well, the charters in Newark do outperform the district schools, and that's unusual because nationally charter schools do not outperform the district, but they do have some very high-performing charters in Newark that are exceeding what the district schools are doing by a lot.
Okay, why?
And, well, one of the things that I saw, there is a difference in just the student makeup. Some charters have almost the same level of poverty as the district does, but some of them don't, and they tend not to have this. If they do have comparable numbers on special needs children, they may not have the same severity of needs that the kids have. So this affects the overall. But I think that the bigger underlying issue is that at least the charter school that I followed the most was this Spark Academy, which is a KIPP elementary school. And they got so much more of their per student funding to the building and the classroom, so that the principal of that school was able to use the money to build services around the children, so that when they had trouble, either because some of them were so many years behind academically, or because they had emotional problems going on, or even some of them had severe symptoms of real trauma, they had two teachers in every classroom, and they had a tutor for every grade, so that if a child, with the smaller groups of having two teachers still couldn't keep up, a third teacher pushed in and worked with them. They also had 3 social workers in the building compared to only 1 in the district schools. And so in that school, they had 70 children who had therapy every week, group or individual therapy, because the emotional needs they had were such that they couldn't learn otherwise. They even had a dean of student and family engagement, and it was her job to deal with any issues that were impinging on a child's learning from outside the classroom. So in some cases, she would get a family member, or if it wasn't a family member, a neighbor or an older sibling who could be the person responsible for each child's education. So there was always an adult who was making sure that education was a priority in this child's life.
Wasn't this the school where they actually picked up the children of the family who were living in a shelter?
Yes.
They had a whole relay system almost of making sure there was always somebody there to pick these kids up at a designated spot, bring them to school and take them back again.
Yes, there was a mother who was beaten badly by her boyfriend, and she was put into, after going to court and everything, ended up in a battered women's shelter with her children, and she had 3 children at this school, and because they were in a secret location, they could no longer ride the bus that the school provided. So there was this dean created a schedule in which 7 different teachers and staff members, each day, one of them would pick the children up, bring them to school, and another one would take them back to this designated location. Yeah, and not one of them missed a day of school in spite of this ordeal.
Now, the idea of the charter having all these services, of course, and you mentioned that they are able to put the money in the classroom.
Now, I don't think that every charter does this. This one particular charter did.
But you do raise the point about how the district, about getting money in the classroom.
Right.
Is it only just a matter of the districts don't get as much money, or are they not as good as putting the money where they need it? What did you find?
The district gets as much money, they get more money per student than the charters do. But there is a problem of just legacy costs at the central office level.
What does that mean, legacy costs?
Well, I think it means a lot of things. One thing that it means, which is really immovable, is that they have more senior employees who are they cost more salary-wise, they cost more health care-wise. Much more so than the charter schools do. But in addition, there are jobs that have been in the district forever that may or may not have been put there to serve the schools or to serve education. Mm-hmm. There are contracts that are clearly sweetheart deals with people who had a lot of political influence. And those kinds of things have not been vetted and, weeded out to the extent they need to be so that money can get to the classroom.
Not spent as wisely. Now, you did mention the ripple effect of expanding the charters on the district schools. What was the effect there?
Well, when the charters expand, the money follows the children. So as children leave the district schools, money goes out of the district schools. And actually, at the end of this year, I believe $350 million is going to be going to charter schools that in past years went to district schools. This is because parents are voting with their feet and losing faith in the district. But the problem is the district can't downsize one for one as quickly as that. And so they have a budget crisis, and they've had to close and consolidate schools and lay off staff, lay off teachers. Thousands of children have had to go from one building to another each year, or in a period of years they have to travel across parks that are not the ideal place for children to be walking because there may be gang activity or drug activity. And parents have been extremely stressed out about the dangers to their children of having to go into different and unfamiliar neighborhoods. So there's a lot of stress that ends up in the district schools.
I had some sympathy for Cammie Anderson when she observed that the very parents who put their children in the charter schools were then picketing and protesting the closing of a district school because someone they knew was going to lose a job. But because of their kids and other children like them moving to the charter, the enrollment in the district schools got too low. And I felt for her when she made that observation that the very same people who moved their kids to charters are now picketing at the district.
Yes, I mean, someone had said to me, why is it with so many people putting their kids in charter schools that there was such public opposition to the charters expanding? And I said, they're the same people. And I think it's like people who want their taxes cut, but they don't want their services cut.
Right, of course.
You want all the benefits and none of the costs.
Now, the unions and seniority is a big issue, not just in Newark, but we're certainly hearing about it all the time. What was your take? Are the unions really an obstacle to productive change? Or, as the other side says, is this merely a hedge fund dreamland of privatizing education and just busting unions?
Well, I think that a lot can be done short of busting unions. But I think that what happened was the unions became completely defensive. That they wanted to protect what they had, and they wanted to fight all changes, and that became a real logjam. I should say, though, that in the teachers' contract that they negotiated, there was a lot of compromise. Teachers voted for a new contract that said nobody gets a raise anymore unless they're rated highly effective or effective, and there had never been that kind of a caveat. Raises were pretty much a function of having been in the district for a full year, you got your raise.
So this whole idea of merit pay, then, I just read in the paper this week that the Newark contract is up again now, and the teachers don't want merit pay to be a part of that package. What happened with merit pay? Wasn't it good that some people got more money? Why do you think the teachers now are saying, we don't want it, we'd rather have a strong principal?
Well, I think that merit pay was, first of all, the merit pay that was awarded in Newark wasn't a lot of money.
Right.
It was, I mean, certainly anybody was happy to get it. It was $5,000 if you were rated at the very top of the scale, and if you were also in a high poverty school, that became $10,000. So it was a nice present, but it didn't really dramatically change the teacher's way of life. I think in Washington D.C. the bonuses were much greater, and that was a different story.
So, as we move from Newark, and this is a story of national importance, you asked the question, who's in charge of America's schools? And I guess my question is to you, who is in charge of America's schools?
Well, I think it's a constant struggle. And I think that, because there's so much money in education, most people don't stop to think about that. But as I said, the Newark district was spending $1 billion a year. I think nationally there's $600 billion a year in private contracts that the school districts around the country let out. And so there's a huge struggle of people who want that money and they want to control the agenda. But then there are the parents who also, are just thinking about, my child. And of course now we have the education reform movement and philanthropists who have their own vision of how schools ought to be organized. So there's a tremendous fight going on.
The book makes a big point we didn't even get to talk about that much about the top-down approach that they used without, what was that big mistake there that you think we should all be paying attention to as we look nationally?
Well, I think that this reform effort was, the way that people in Newark described it, it was done to Newark rather than with Newark.
Think that's true?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think that it was done in part because the reformers thought that the powers that be in Newark had always controlled the money and controlled the schools, and that they had not done well by the children, so they felt we need to go around them.
Right. And they knew better.
And they knew better, and
right.
we know what works was
right.
the mantra.
Right.
But I think that there's another point of view that people have to be part of their own liberation. And if you want change to be sustainable, you don't impose it from the top down, you cultivate it, and people in the community have to be the voices of change.
So the lessons to be learned from this, obviously education reform is a big movement. What would you want us to extrapolate from the Newark story? What are the lessons you think that we should learn, and what are the key elements, do you think, of improving schools?
Well, I do think that, a lot of what they did was important. I think that trying to have better management in school districts is critical, to have, accountability for teachers that, isn't too prescriptive is really important. But I also feel that you cannot emphasize the classroom enough, and that is not something that you can have a silver bullet for or a model that can be scaled up nationally. That's something that has to happen school by school, classroom by classroom, and there has to be just that kind of commitment to the teacher and the child.
And can the schools trump poverty?
Not on their own, no way.
What would they need to have, do you think?
Well, I think you need to have healthier cities. And, I know that there are a lot of ideas now around this model called the community school, where there are services for the neighborhood and the adults as well as the children. And that sounds like, a much healthier and holistic approach, but that also doesn't solve the problem of cities where there's tremendous poverty and violence that upends children's lives every day.
What do you think Mark Zuckerberg learned from this regarding that?
Well, I think he learned that there is no silver bullet, and that you don't try to find a national model that you could scale up like a startup business, but you actually work district by district to understand what the needs of the children are in each district. I think he really did learn that.
So if there had been no special interests, if everyone in Newark, this will be our last question, if everyone in Newark had been on board with change, what do you think would be the things that would have made the most positive difference in the lives of children in the Newark schools?
Getting the money to the classroom. I think that's just the most important thing. And but also having principals who understand how to use that money strategically to support the children. Because if you just increase everyone's budget and say, hire whomever you want, you're not going to see anything except more money going out the door.
Thank you so much for this, to me, really important conversation, and I want to thank you so much for appearing with us on the program. The author of the prize, who's in charge of America's schools, was really wonderful having you on the program.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
And don't go away. We'll be right back with our Ed Bites. Welcome back to this edition of Ed Bites.
Most educators acknowledge that kindergarten in the U.S. is the new first grade. 5-year-olds spend the day on literacy and math instruction with ever-diminishing amounts of time set aside for play. But this is not an international trend. Researchers report that in Finland, that bastion of high academic student performance, the emphasis is on learning through play. Finnish educators believe that fun and child-directed play have cognitive, social, emotional, and physical benefits. Children are exposed to books, but not pushed to learn how to read. Kindergarten, say these educators, should promote joyful learning.
Last month, we reported on President Obama's college scorecard, a way for families to compare colleges, including earnings among graduates. Critics have already decried the scorecard's emphasis on assessing the worth of a college based on future salaries. Now education researchers point to another flaw. The scorecard does not separate correlation from causation. Because graduates of a college earn more money does not prove that the college itself is the reason for the boost. The graduates of schools that accept the most qualified and talented students are more likely to have higher earnings without demonstrating that attending a particular school is the reason.
Also last month, we reported that according to the Gallup-Purdue University poll, life satisfaction was not contingent upon attending a prestigious university. Yet, the poll revealed that overall, only 50% of students strongly agreed that their college education was worth the cost. Inside Higher Ed reports that the higher the student debt, the less likely students felt college was worth it, while those students who felt emotionally supported in college were more likely to agree.
Over the years, there has been a national push to create small schools and even dismantle large ones. Results are mixed as to the effectiveness of this approach. Size, it seems, is not the only factor in building successful schools. What goes on inside those schools, including instructional practice, is key. EdCast will take an in-depth look at the small schools movement in an upcoming episode.
I attended both small schools and large schools, and there's something to be said for both. I had more resources in the bigger schools, but more tension in the smaller ones. So
It'll be interesting to see what makes them work.
Well, that does it for this edition of EdCast.
Till next time, class dismissed.